and welcome to Forbidden Planet TV. And on today's episode, we are joined by Katherine Arden to talk about the warm hands of ghosts. Hi, Katherine.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's going super well. It rained yesterday, but today it's sort of grey, so less wet, which is kind of nice.
It's going spring-like?
Spring to winter to springish. I went looking for flowers in the rain yesterday. I love flowers, and so I was just like the weirdo. Rain's pouring down. I'm just like bending over to like photograph a daffodil. And all of London's like, what are you doing?
What's going on? Funny you say flowers, because we were talking upstairs about it's the day after Mothering Sunday here, so all the flowers are really cheap, so everyone's like running into the store and like buying loads of flowers. So yeah, it's the time.
I went to this like cafe near Lambeth Gardens, and it was full. It was like a garden cafe, right? And it was just full of people, and I was like, what's happening? It's like, oh, it's Mother's Day. It's like, because it was just like the garden cafe, like, you know, tea with mom kind of thing. So I got it. It was really sweet. It was really sweet.
That is very, very sweet. So to chat about your new book.
Yes.
So is this your 8th?
This is officially my 8th. I've written 3 books for adults and 4 for children.
Yes.
So it's my 4th book for adults and my 8th book overall that's been published.
That's great.
So time flies, right? It does. It really does.
And so what made you pick this particular kind of time period, and what can you tell us without too many spoilers?
Yeah, for sure. So The Warm Hands of Ghosts is set in the last year of World War I. So it opens in December of 1917 and it goes until sort of just after Armistice Day, so November of 1918. So right at a year of time in the book. And my first trilogy, this was set in medieval Russia. It was a historical fantasy, sort of set in this kind of like 14th century in Muscovy. And I knew I wanted to do another historical fantasy. I really enjoy kind of how myth can inform history and vice versa. And I was casting around for a new time period to work in, and I happened to stumble into a bookstore in Massachusetts. I was in Boston, and I saw this book in the nonfiction section. It was a history of World War I, and it had this picture on the cover of a well-known picture of a German cavalry officer from 1916, and he was on a horse, had this giant spear in one hand, but he was wearing a gas mask. And it was a very strange picture. It's like a bit sort of, imagine a knight on horseback, but also kind of sort of techno horror, like gas masks are scary. And this picture looks surreal. And it felt like fantasy a little bit. And I was like, interesting. And so I started doing some World War I research, and I was lost. Like, World War I is such a rabbit hole of history and memoir and fact and speculation. And before long, I knew I wanted to do a book set during World War I. And in the novel, the finished novel, it's about 2 siblings. They're both Canadians from Halifax, Nova Scotia. The brother is a soldier, and his older sister is a nurse, a combat nurse. And the sister is injured in sort of October of 1917. She's invalided home to Canada. This disaster strikes. Her parents are killed at the same time. She gets her brother's effects from the front lines, but there's some weird inconsistencies in how she receives this like box of his stuff, and she's unconvinced that he's dead. And so she contrives a way to return to Flanders, to Belgium, where she was nursing before, to try and find out what happened to her younger brother. That's kind of the premise of the novel.
I really, really enjoyed as well that it's kind of the brother and sister relationship, because not that it would be too obvious to have the, you know, like the lovers kind of parted by war, but it was quite kind of refreshing in a way to have like that sibling.
I've always enjoyed sibling relationships. I've always been interested by them. I felt also that sort of the wonderful World War I novel about parted sort of lovers has been done. A very long engagement by, what was that writer?
Irene.
It was an amazing book. That book.
Yes,
right? It won the Prix Goncourt.
Yes.
It won a bunch of prizes. It was a movie. So I wanted to do siblings, and also one of the big sort of themes of the book is how the world changed so drastically and so irrevocably during the war years, and I felt like siblings who had known each other from long before this big transition happened through these changes would be a better platform to kind of like explore ideas of change and loss and continuity than a couple would be who would have known each other less well and for less long. So that was why too.
Yeah, it's really and it's so impactful. I know obviously a lot of people will have had relatives, grandparents and stuff kind of.
For sure.
And I know there's not quite the same, but a similar kind of thing in World War II. My grandfather went missing in action and then turned up on my nan's like doorstep 6 months later.
That's an incredible story.
Which is just so
gosh.
so
I feel like it's funny, almost everyone you talk to has something like that. Like my grandfather did this, my great uncle did this, my great grandfather died here. Like it feels, it's such a part of our history, these two world wars, and I think it's hard to overstate how widespread the societal damage was and the societal change, like just how many people died or came back not the same, kind of thing too.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, and even I suppose recent talk of they're saying about conscription, if we were to ever like go to another war, and you're just thinking, oh my God, have we truly learned nothing?
World War I ended, and one of the people's like strongest beliefs was we've ended war.
Yeah.
We can't do it again. Like we're done. We have managed to do the war that ended all wars, and that lasted for a decade.
Yes.
And then it started again. So just absolutely terrible time history.
Definitely. And I suppose the idea of that quite often in other fantasy novels, I suppose war and battle is seen as like some kind of rite of passage or some kind of this kick-ass hero is going to save the day, but here it's obviously the subject matter and it's such kind of a sensitive look at kind of warfare and not kind of glorifying that. How important was...
I mean, it's almost impossible to glorify World War I in particular because in this incredibly mechanized space, there's just no room for individual heroism. Like there just isn't space for it. No one guy can make a difference. Full stop. Like you can be the bravest and the strongest guy, but you can't change the course of anything. Maybe a little skirmish, but you're talking about armies of millions of people. And it's one of the big kind of themes of the book is what an impersonal space, what an sort of almost inhuman space the battlefield can be, because it just erases individuality. Because kind of the individual human, like their soul, their talents, their vices, none of that really matters. But it does make for a space where you can't really glorify a battlefield.
Yes.
So yeah, that's one of the big themes of the book actually.
And I suppose the idea of the lack of communication, which it's crazy when you think about it now, because obviously you can pick up your phone or easily kind of jump online, a multitude of social media outlets and stuff. Yet obviously thinking back to if you had a family member at war, you wouldn't know day to day what their life is.
No, I mean, there's telegrams obviously you could send sometimes, and obviously letters. They're censored, there's censorship. And this is the era right before kind of mass communication. There's no radio yet. And so communication was a huge, not just between like soldiers and their families, but between units of the military. Like being able to just communicate with your front soldiers is almost impossible because the wires get cut from the phones, and then it's just like messenger pigeons, like dogs, like humans running. Like it's just so hard to like send news back and forth that caused a lot of trouble with attacks, because you get to a certain place and this you couldn't call for backup, you couldn't call for reinforcements, you couldn't call to retreat, you're just kind of like, well, we're here now. It was kind of one of those wars where you had these massive mismatches in technology where artillery can fire 50 miles, but you can't talk to the guy, in the next trench, right? If phone wires are cut. And it just creates these weird, almost juxtapositions. You have like, you start the war with cavalry, and by the end there's tanks. In 1907, the Wright brothers flew for the first time, and by 1916 there's combat aircraft. That's so fast. People tried suits of armor to deal with machine guns. And that's kind of the almost fantastical side of this war that I was thinking of when I wrote this book, how the war felt, or must have felt, so surreal to the people living in it, because just how can these things exist in the same space? It was really fascinating to me.
And we obviously have to touch on the idea of the otherworldly, which is obviously where the kind of the ghost element kind of comes into it. So we mentioned before off camera about being fans of kind of horror books and horror films and that type of thing. How did that kind of feed into the idea of kind of the ghost?
I feel like almost all my books have like a bit of a horror element, even if they aren't. My books for children are horror novels.
Yes.
I've written horror for children, not for adults. But I read a bunch of memoirs when I was doing research for The Warm Hands of Ghosts, and one thing that struck me in almost every memoir is someone mentions a ghost. Like either somebody saw their dead friend, their dead captain, I saw him through the window, I saw him at a distance, I saw him at night. And it just felt like such a matter-of-fact part of life in this back area behind the front lines, which understandably you have such mass death in this like, small area. And actually the title of the novel, The Warm Hands of Ghosts, came from one of those ghost stories that I read. A Canadian soldier named Will Bird was asleep in his dugout with 3 other guys, and his brother shows up. His brother had vanished 2 years before in a different part of the line, but his brother shows up. It's like, Will, wake up, come with me. Takes Will's hand, pulls him out of the dugout. Will is fully convinced his brother is actually there. He's like, oh, you're alive, amazing. And he follows his brother down the trench, kind of, wait up kind of thing. And he follows him around a curve, and the brother vanishes. And he spends like an hour searching, fully convinced his brother's alive. Can't find him. Goes back to his dugout, which has in the meantime been flattened by a direct hit, and they're all dead inside.
Wow.
And the thing that struck this guy, Will Bird, most from this experience is that his brother's hands were warm. He kept saying it, but his hands were warm. I remember his warm hands. And I was sure he was alive because his hands were warm. And title.
Wow.
It was such a striking image. So I it didn't feel like a stretch to have ghosts, because it was a moment that just felt haunted. And the other kind of big fantasy element came from actually the Bible. I reread the Book of Revelation when I was doing research, in part because so many writers had framed the war in apocalyptic terms. They called it Armageddon, they called it the 4 horsemen, these kind of biblical images. And so I'm reading the Book of Revelation just for inspiration, for vibes, for trying to find the cultural context of the people fighting. And this one quote really inspired me when the prophet, it's a well-known quotation, when the prophet goes, and I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the old passed away. My rejoinder in my head was, did you see a new hell too? I was like, what did you see? Like, what happens to hell at the end of the world? And then it occurred to me that in the 19th century, like pre-war, if you asked somebody to describe a hellscape, they would probably mention a fantasy place, like in Paradise Lost, Pandemonium, that big golden city, Dante's 9 Circles, the things happening down there. Maybe Odysseus in the underworld looking for his father, like these sort of fantastical spaces. But if you ask somebody to describe a 20th century hellscape, they might tell you a real place. They might say, oh, well, Hiroshima. They might say Dresden. They might say Auschwitz. They might say Passchendaele. And it felt like that was the essential transition, right, in hellscapes from fantastical to realistic. And then I asked myself, what would, in a hellscape that's man-made, what would the devil do? And that was kind of the impetus for that sort of fantasy aspect of the novel. So ghosts, and then there's this other hellscape aspect.
Because that's definitely a subject matter that's come up with a few authors that we've had on the channel, is the idea of religion, and whether there some authors we've spoken to have had a religious upbringing and maybe had that element of not forced as such, but like that they've grown to question it as they become an adult and stuff. So it's so interesting to kind of
I mean, in this book I feel like I think of religion as like folklore, as like part of the cultural context of people's lives. I'm not sort of thinking about the pros and cons of it. It's just almost like the water everyone's swimming in.
Yeah.
Religion and Christianity, obviously, in this time period. But I do think it's interesting how different authors and like their takes on religion. I think horror as a genre is a genre that especially can really grapple with like the sort of like difficulties, ramifications of organized religion.
Yes, definitely. I think I mentioned to you before about Philip Fracassi was over last year, and I read Boys in the Valley, which is one of my favourite books of last year. But yeah, definitely the idea of that no one can quite save you from this, even your own belief is not going to kind of pull you through.
I do feel like of all the sort of modern genres of filmmaking, horror is the only one that takes religion as like a force in people's lives. Yeah. Whether it's positive or negative, I think it's the only genre grappling with it at all, which is interesting to me, actually. Yeah. You know, I do think horror, one thing I love about it is that it can tackle questions and anxieties that other genres just leave alone, and I really like that.
Yeah.
Like things like grief and loss and like sort of almost ugly things that you have no words for can be like embodied in horror. So
yeah, I think it kind of invites everyone to the party.
It does.
Kind of
it's so interesting. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, definitely. And we have to obviously touch on the Angel of Mons.
Yes. So I read a lot of like trench and period myths relating to the war, and of course the Angel of Mons began as a short story. So Arthur Machen, who's one of his quotations is in my epigraph in the novel, he wrote the short story for, I think it was the Evening Standard, where he was like, oh well, during the retreat from Mons there was all was lost, but then these archers from Agincourt, these ghost archers, like popped out of the clouds and like, you know, and saved the British. You know, that was the story. And sort of for some reason the story became taken as fact in the popular imagination, and the ghost archers became angels. All these rumors about how like the Germans had been found with arrow wounds in them went around, and this poor guy who wrote the story is like, it's fiction. I wrote a story. It was fictional. And nobody believed him. Just like it was taken as fact. Priests like preached, you know, sermons about this. Like it was a whole thing.
Wow.
And I took it as people in a moment where the world's beginning to destabilize are searching for certainties. And you want to believe that there's you know, a divine army on your side, right? And so they wanted to believe, and so they kind of did. And I took kind of the rise of ghost stories sort of later in the conflict as being, you know, you're still longing for something outside yourself, something you can't see, but you're kind of over hoping for angels. You're just hoping for your brother, you know, or for your friend. Like forget the divine, just my, you know, my dead cousin. So, and then the other kind of really interesting myth I ran across was the story of wild men. Another just very strange trench legend, that the idea was that some men who had vanished hadn't died, they had deserted, but they hadn't left the battlefield. They were living in abandoned trenches in this kind of like wild society from all countries, like Germans, Italians, Austrians, French, wherever, and they would come out at night to no man's land to like rob the dead and like have wild orgies. And I think that story, just the idea is you're trying to assert some kind of humanity on a space that is inimical to humans, right? It's literally no man's land.
Yeah.
And I think the idea is you're trying to assert some kind of human power or some kind of common humanity that's stronger than the war. You know, just something, anything, like, even if it's wild men. Like I do think these different myths really speak to how people were changing as the war went on, and their hopes for, staying human in a world that was quite, it felt quite, mechanical, and you felt quite helpless as a person in this world. And I just,
it's quite interesting as well, because it's saying the mechanical and almost kind of alien nature of the technology of the time. It was, I suppose, almost easier to kind of, I don't know, imagine a ghost form of a missing relative, of something you could recognise.
I mean, anything to assert like a kind of humanity being stronger than machines. I mean, that's why I wanted, because if you think about sort of the classical 19th century devil, that's a character who loves people. Like, he loves the individuality of people. Like, the whole point is that he gets to know somebody, like their vices, their pride, their vulnerabilities, and uses that to like corrupt them. That's the whole point. He loves people. But take this character and put them in this war zone where the individual doesn't really matter. Like, so it just felt like an interesting juxtaposition, and sort of, what I found fascinating.
And how do you think your kind of process has differed from kind of your first few books to now, and obviously your middle grade fiction, which is, I presume, going to be very different?
Middle grade is different because it's a different audience and much shorter. Yeah. My middle grades are about 40,000 words a piece, so half to a third the length of like one of the adult books. And of course, this is my first standalone novel, whereas these are series. I mean, Ghosts was, I think, a particular case because it was a book that was hard to write. Right. I'm not even now sure why. Maybe it's a more complex novel, like thematically, emotionally, sort of structurally. And it just is a book that took a long time. And I think in part it was because it seemed to resist any kind of planning. I would try and plan the book. I'd be like, okay, I'm doing this, and amazing. And then I would write, and it would all fall apart. And I would do it again. Plan, write, fall apart. And it just, the only way it seemed like I could make real progress was to literally trial and error. Like, write a scene, see if it worked, scrap it, or keep it and keep going. Like, and it just, like, sort of this iterating process of writing, and it's not efficient at all. And it didn't work, but I wouldn't recommend it because it just was this like difficult, like slow process. And I got there in the end, but it was just a book that for some reason I couldn't just write normally. And I don't actually want to do another book like that because it was very like frustrating. But I'm sort of hopeful that I learned from it or became a better writer because of it. Like, fingers crossed, right? So we'll see. But it was a unique case, this book's process.
It's wonderfully written. So
thank
you for persevering. It's quite interesting because I suppose we assume that because this author's had X amount of books that it gets easier, and it doesn't necessarily.
There's a thing called second book syndrome, and it's not my 8th book, but it's kind of, so in theory, I've written kids' books, different, and then my first 3 books for adults were not just a series, but a very continuous series. Like, it was the same story in 3 parts, and book 2 picks up where book 1 ends, essentially. So it could be one novel, one giant novel in theory. And so this was my first completely different foray into adult fiction, and so it might have been a bit of like this second book syndrome where authors suddenly feel this pressure that they hadn't felt before, possibly, or it could be just a difficult subject that I struggled with. That happens too. But yeah, I suppose it's finished. It's very satisfying to see it.
It's very beautiful.
I don't have to write it ever again.
And I suppose maybe in a way, even though it is kind of obviously World War One, it feels like more recent history in a way. If you're going further back, it's maybe easier to remove yourself from that.
One thing about medieval Russia, which was my last sort of historical moment, was that there aren't that many primary sources. There are none, really. You're looking at secondary sources, research, archaeology, sort of folklore as well. But you have plenty of space to imagine stuff. Whereas, like, in World War One, it was possibly the most well-documented conflict in history, all these people who were fighting it were so literate because they'd grown up before mass communication, no radios, and so they lived their lives using the written word for everything, for communication, for fun, and just everyone, it felt like, who fought and didn't die wrote a memoir or had tons of letters, had a diary, and just you can dive into this rabbit hole of like the voices of people who actually fought, and you can see their pictures and know that who their descendants are and what their wives were named, and just there's so much there. And if you're a researcher like I am, and I just love to learn things, you just can just go and go and go forever. And so at some point you have to stop and say, I'm doing a me thing. Like it's got to be me in there too. But it almost feels presumptuous to like insert yourself in your imagination in this space, because people live there. People feel like it was their lives and their future, and you're just, it almost feels like you're playing. And it was I did struggle a bit with that when I was writing, like what right do I have to make this up? So I got there, but it was slow. A lot of beating my head on the desk gently.
Gently, not like, to cause any
no, just like give me that.
So coming back to because I always love talking to people that love horror. There's a special kind of
good genre. Oh my gosh.
So is there any particular things that you're looking forward to this year, or any kind of things that have flown a bit under the radar that need like
novel-wise? I'm looking forward to The Angel of Indian Lake by Stephen Graham Jones, which is the third book in his is there a series name for those books? I think it's the Proof Rock trilogy or something.
Yeah, I'm not sure if the trilogy name is necessarily...
Is there one? Anyway, it's 3 books about this fantastic character named Jade Daniels, a young woman.
We just call it the Jade Daniels.
Jade Daniels books. Like, the first one is called My Heart is a Chainsaw.
I still want a t-shirt.
Right. The second book's called Don't Fear the Reaper, and the third book is coming out this year. It's called The Angel of Indian Lake. I'm very excited. I've been reading a book that I think needs more love, which is The Will of the Many by James Islington.
Yeah,
actually a wonderful novel.
It sounds incredible. Actually, I remember his previous series from a few years back now. So
and it's just one of those books that I feel like everyone who's read it loves it. It's super interesting. Kind of this Roman Empire flavored fantasy world. I'm really enjoying it. I'm about 2/3 of the way through. So
very cool. Very cool.
Yeah. Check it out for sure.
There's, I mean, it's great to kind of, it feels like a huge kind of development into horror. There's more horror being picked up. It's great to see.
It's great seeing. I feel like there's been a horror renaissance in film too. And like when I wrote my first horror novel for children in 2018, and it felt like just me with my little horror book, but like now there's so many fascinating writers like doing horror in that space, like as a whole like spooky genre. Less in the UK, I would say, but in the US it's quite a big thing right now, is like horror for children. We import a hell of a lot into the stores. It is mostly US, but there's some great books. I love to see it. I do think kids enjoy being scared, and I think it's a healthy part of like being a kid, is like spooky tales. So
the campfire kind of.
The campfire, and just like, I don't know, it's fun to try out fear in a safe space, right? Where you're like under your covers, you're at home, you're safe, but you're just like getting the tingles, like a little bit scared, I think it's healthy. And they like to read books aloud at slumber parties and stuff. It's fun, and I loved being a scared kid when I was little. I like scary books, and so
those things stick with you.
Right? Absolutely. I'm glad the genre's getting more love.
It needs it. Me too. And I think there's kind of a newer wave of editors who are coming through who really want to pick up horror, and you're just like,
I just read The Last House on Needler Street. I loved it.
That stuff is always amazing. Incredible author.
So many good writers coming out now with new stuff.
Definitely. Well, for our last kind of question, and then we're gonna have to have you back on so we can do like a horror deep dive.
Oh, can we please? If you ever do horror panels, I would happily.
God. Yes.
Actually though, would happily get online for
we're planning like hopefully a couple coming up. I've already spoken to V Castro about doing something with erotica and horror.
Oh yeah.
And hopefully getting Eric the Rocker on, because he hasn't.
Well, yeah, feel free to reach out to me. Yeah.
Yes.
Love horror.
Yay.
Yeah.
And to finish our interview today, what are you working on next?
So I have a new adult project that I am maybe halfway into. It was set in the modern day. I needed a break from research. So modern day book.
No research required.
Yes. I wrote a picture book recently.
Okay.
Mostly because this was quite a dark topic, and I wanted something like adorable in my life, and so I wrote a book about a magic fish. Be out in September.
Okay.
It's really cute. And then I have a new scary book for kids that I have drafted, but needs to be like worked on a bit. That will be a standalone, I think.
Okay.
And so I like having different irons in the fire at one time.
Yeah, that's very exciting. I can see why you'd if that was a challenging book to read, that it's nice to have some things.
Yeah, I wanted some slightly more straightforward things. Like I felt like some projects should be hard, and some should be a little bit more like just not like easy, but just like straightforward. You know?
Yeah. And you finished the small spaces.
Yes, there are 4.
Yeah.
It's sort of a seasonal series. There's like a fall, winter, spring, and a summer. And the last one came out in paperback the last year. So finished those. Yeah.
Well, we look forward to obviously more, including the picture book.
I'm excited. The illustrator is amazing. She has these beautiful watercolors. It's so charming. Just beautiful, dreamy pictures, and I had so much fun writing it. It was just a fun project for me. And one thing I didn't know is just how much more work the illustrator does than the author. It's like
oh god,
you know, it's like they're the real heroes of picture books. Like you're like, I wrote my 800 words, here you go, and they're like working for months, these beautiful images, and so all credit to her. Her name is Zara Marwan. She's a wonderful watercolorist. So well, lots to look forward to then, which is great news. But thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for having me on. Yeah, it's great.
Sign a ton of books now.
Oh yes, it looks like we have a whole collection.
We have a whole haul.
Amazing.
Which is great.
Yeah.
But anyone at home who wants to grab a signed copy, you can pop to the link below, grab yourself a signed copy of the new book or any of the backlist. And also on any of our stores, we'll be getting some signed stock as well later this week. So pop in soon, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much.
If you're enjoying watching Forbidden Planet TV and you're enjoying watching us talk to the world's most interesting and accomplished filmmakers, authors, artists, musicians, creators, subscribe right here. See you soon.